The Earth is old, really old, around 4.5 billion years old, in fact. It's a scale that is simply eye-watering to imagine, and such a vast expanse of time really can feel impossible to comprehend. In fact, in the grand scheme of things, the amount of time we as a species have been present on our planet is really a drop in the ocean geologically. To put it in perspective, Homo sapiens first evolved and adopted an anatomically modern body plan in the region of 300,000 years ago. That's around 0.067% of the entire time the planet has existed. In other words, if the entire history of the Earth was condensed to a 24-hour clock, our entire Homo sapiens existence would work out at just shy of 6 seconds. And if we look a little further back to also include our oldest Homo ancestors, Homo habilis, which evolved around 2.4 million years ago, our genus has only existed for the last 46 seconds of a 24-hour clock, less than a single minute out of a full day. So if our own existence is such a tiny proportion of the Earth's total life, and even less our recorded history, what came before us? Well, a lot. And we'll be taking a whistle-stop tour between all 4 of the major eons in the Earth's history, plus exploring the smaller eras that make up these eons. Before we start, though, we should probably define what an eon and an epoch actually are. An eon is the longest geochronologic time unit based on the geologic timescale that we use to measure the age of the Earth. There are 4 formally defined eons in the Earth's history: the Hadean, Archean, Proterozoic, and Phanerozoic. Next, we have eras. Eras are used to break down eons into small portions of time, typically characterized by certain environmental conditions. With that out of the way, let's dive headfirst into the history of the Earth. And the first stop on our journey, the Hadean Eon. As we just mentioned, the Hadean Eon was the first epoch in the history of the Earth, covering the time span between around 4.5 billion and 4 billion years ago. This half-billion-year time span covered the entire formation and stabilization of the Earth, and it was tumultuous, to say the least. In short, there's a reason it was named after the Greek god of the underworld himself. The Hadean Eon was characterized by a seemingly hellish landscape on the early Earth, with conditions completely unrecognizable to the Earth we have today. In short, if you were to travel back in time to witness the Earth during this period of its life, you'd be hard-pressed to recognize it as our home planet at all. At the very outset of the Hadean, the Earth was completely uninhabitable. Perhaps most notably during this time, the Earth's surface was incredibly unstable, with convection currents continually bringing molten rock from the Earth's core to the surface in a continually shifting cycle of lava. This was further complicated by frequent bombardments to the young Earth by space debris, comets, and asteroids that pummeled the Earth while its gravity was still incredibly weak. In fact, it's believed that our moon was formed in this manner, shortly after the formation of the early Earth itself, when a Mars-sized body known as Theia is believed to have collided with the Earth. While much of this matter was absorbed into the Earth, significant amounts of debris were flung into orbit by the event, eventually coalescing to become what we now call the Moon. However, as the Hadean passed by, conditions slowly improved, and we're using the term slowly generously there, as what we really mean is at an almost unperceivably slow pace. We don't know exactly when things begin to stabilize, but since the oldest known rocks in the world have been dated to 4.2 billion years ago, roughly halfway through the Hadean, we can say with some certainty that conditions were beginning to settle at around this time, or likely earlier. At around the same time as the Earth's crust stabilized and solidified, and the Earth's atmosphere began to form, cooling conditions on the ancient planet's atmosphere finally also made it possible for water to condense and settle on the surface of the planet in liquid form. Prior to this, all water on Earth would have instantly evaporated away, only present as vapor, but the cooling conditions finally made it possible for early seas to form. Admittedly, these seas were still so hot they'd probably cook you alive, but they were there at last. Finally, the early Earth was no longer the stuff of nightmares, and the hellish conditions had calmed and lessened to a degree. Although the climate was still incredibly extreme, things had finally settled enough for the Earth to move to the second eon of its story, the Archean. current theories posit that the transition was hardly smooth, with one widely accepted theory, the late heavy bombardment hypothesis, suggesting that a period of extreme asteroid strikes once again fell upon the Earth and its young moon, leading to the distinct craters we still see on the moon today. That said, this is only a theory, and direct evidence for the hypothesis is limited. The Archean eon spanned around 1.5 billion years, lasting from 4 billion to 2.55 billion years ago. The eon was characterized by being almost entirely a water world, with deep oceans covering the entire planet. Unfortunately, with the exception of moon craters, we have very limited geological evidence of events during the Archean due to tectonic activities. While the Earth was somewhat more recognizable in this eon than it had been in the Hadean, things were still vastly different, especially on the molecular level. For one thing, the atmosphere itself was completely different, with a significant amount of methane present and very little oxygen. In other words, if you were to travel back in time to the Archean, you'd suffocate in a matter of moments. That wasn't to last forever, though, and the very first life on Earth was set to change things. Yes, the first life is believed to have evolved during the Archean, even in the absence of much oxygen, in the form of stromatolites, which were shallow water microbial mats. These mats were likely comprised of early types of cyanobacteria, plus anaerobic pseudomedota and sulfate-reducing bacteria. Following on from the Archean, the next eon in the Earth's history is the Proterozoic, and at almost 2 billion years, from 2.5 billion until 538 million years ago, it's also the longest eon of Earth's history. Of the three predominant species in the Archean, cyanobacteria were perhaps the most notable of all, due to their massive impact on the environment. Indeed, as the earliest photosynthesizers, cyanobacteria produced vast quantities of oxygen. So much so, in fact, that their activity led to the Great Oxidation Event around 2.46 to 2 billion years ago. This caused a catastrophic shift in the composition of the Earth's climate, critically by reducing the amount of methane in the atmosphere and leading to the development of the ozone layer. This massive shift led to a period of immense global cooling, with researchers hypothesizing that this exact event led to one of the earliest ice ages on Earth. However, it also caused what was likely the very first major extinction event in Earth's history, with the high oxygen levels and cooling temperatures proving toxic and deadly to most microbial mats at the time. Although, due to the difficulty in estimating species loss from the time, the paleontologic community doesn't usually include this in the list of great extinctions. While the Great Oxidation Event was likely to have been devastating for many types of early life, it did also open the doors for the evolution of new aerobic species. Moreover, it is believed that this event would lead to the evolution of eukaryotic organisms, and eventually the earliest multicellular life. Spanning such a long time period, it's safe to say that the Earth changed a great deal over the course of the Proterozoic. However, this time period was perhaps most notable of all for the sheer number of glaciation events it experienced. Perhaps the most severe of all was the Huronian glaciation, which lasted for a staggering 300 million years. Ironically, given the frequent glaciations the Earth was experiencing, volcanic activity was also incredibly common during the Proterozoic era, leading to significant geologic changes. The period also saw several supercontinents come and go, and at least 3 supercontinents are hypothesized to have existed during the time. Namely, from oldest to most recent, these may have included Columbia, Rodinia, and Pannotia. Excitingly, the Proterozoic eon is also the first time period for which we have a definitive geological record still to this day, namely from the Mesoproterozoic era, from 1.6 to 1 billion years ago. Despite the extreme conditions, the Proterozoic would prove the key starting point for new forms and multicellular life on Earth, although progress was admittedly very slow. In fact, the oldest known eukaryotic fossil dates back to around 1.63 billion years ago, although the exact time when eukaryotes emerged is naturally unknown. Finally, reaching around 538.8 million years ago, we reach the Phanerozoic, which is classed as the latest geologic eon. And yes, the one we're still living in now. The eon is characterized by the massive evolutionary diversification seen during its time, and the iconic Cambrian explosion is generally marked as the main starting point of the eon. During the Cambrian explosion, which lasted for around 20 million years at the start of the Phanerozoic, life on Earth experienced sudden and unprecedented evolution and radiation, with almost all animal phyla appearing in the fossil record in some form during this time. The Cambrian explosion saw an extreme amount of diversification in a very short window of time. And some truly bizarre creatures evolved at this point, such as the Hallucigenia, the Anomalocaris, and the Opabinia, to name a few of the oddest specimens. The rapid rate of evolutionary change didn't just stop once the Cambrian explosion concluded either. Indeed, around 40 million years later, after a series of significant extinction events, the Great Ordovician biodiversification event rocked the world, which overhauled many of the existing species from the Cambrian. By now, the seas were largely dominated by mollusks, arthropods, and invertebrates, and the total number of marine orders doubled during this event. Moreover, by the end of the period, fish, as the first true vertebrates, had developed the first jaws, a revolutionary adaptation. In addition to the increasing diversity of marine species, the Ordovician saw the earliest land plants colonizing the barren shores. Alas, all good things eventually come to an end, and the Ordovician Silurian extinction would make that concept true. This extinction event wiped out around 60% of all species in the oceans, making it the first recognized major mass extinction. However, worse was to come later on. Still, as we entered the Silurian, things pretty quickly began to recover, and the surviving species diversified rapidly. Jawed fish, in particular, evolved quickly after the extinction, while jawless fish began to dwindle in numbers, although they would never go fully extinct. The earliest fossil evidence of arthropods' presence on land also appears during this period, although estimates suggest they may have colonized the land earlier, perhaps during the Ordovician. Life on land also continued to grow rapidly, with the previously lifeless rocks now boasting an ever-diversifying array of fungi and vascular plants. This diversification would rapidly continue into the next period, the Devonian, which spanned around 419 million to 358 million years ago. During this period, plants spread rapidly with new evolutionary breakthroughs, allowing them to move further from the shores, including the evolution of leaves, true roots, and even seeds. This would slowly transform the rocky landscapes into an increasingly fertile region. Simultaneously, the diversity and success of land arthropods greatly increased. Still, the main event was still under the waves during the Devonian, which is often referred to as the Age of Fishes. This time saw an incredible amount of diversity among fish species, and the waters very quickly began to be overwhelmed by a relatively recent innovation, the armored placoderms, such as the iconic Dunkleosteus, which brought several game-changing new adaptations. Very primitive early sharks, cartilaginous fishes, and even the beloved ammonites also began to evolve and diversify during this time. Perhaps the most interesting change during the Devonian from our perspective, though, has to be the divergence of tetrapodomorphs from lobe-finned fish. This group would begin to evolve stronger and more muscular pectoral and pelvic fins, which would set them up well for their future. More on that in a minute. Unfortunately, the Devonian would once again come to a catastrophic end, with the late Devonian extinction and end Devonian extinction events occurring relatively close together in terms of geologic time. These combined extinctions would wipe out all of the briefly dominant placoderms, as well as many jawless fish and trilobites. As we've already seen several times, though, even a devastating extinction event wasn't enough to wipe out life on Earth entirely. And as the battered planet crawled into the next period, the Carboniferous, things would slowly begin to rebuild. And so rolled in a brand new age, the age of amphibians. Plant life was already relatively well established by the Carboniferous, but animal life was largely still confined to the waters in the early days. This would rapidly change as the aforementioned tetrapodomorphs began to take a history-changing step. Literally. Indeed, the earliest members of the tetrapodomorphoclade first began establishing themselves during the late Devonian to early Carboniferous, and transitional species such as Tiktaalik began showing features adapted to a life on land, such as sturdy interior fin bones that would have allowed it to briefly prop itself up in shallow waters or on shorelines. Moreover, as the Carboniferous progressed, members of the clade began to develop pentacactylous features. In other words, evolving the five-fingered limb structure. This would allow for better navigation on land, thus leading to rapid diversification among early amphibian species. Moreover, the very first amniotes entered the scene during the late Carboniferous, having evolved from amphibious stem tetrapods. Members of the Amniota clade would also go on to give rise to both the Synapsida clade, to which we mammals belong, and the Sauropsid clade during the later days of the Cretaceous. Perhaps somewhat spurred on by the presence of new competition in the form of tetrapods, and largely also due to the lush landscape of swamplands and forests, the land arthropods and arachnids also experienced an explosion in diversity during the late Carboniferous. Not a good time to have arachnophobia. Once again, though, the end of the Carboniferous would be marked by a new extinction event, although this one was perhaps not quite so dramatic as many of the other major events. Furthermore, tectonic movements would cause the three earlier continental units, Euramerica, Siberia, and Gondwana, to merge into the single supercontinent Pangaea, which was characterized by having vast swaths of desert, in particular in the interior of the continent. This unique land arrangement would prove to be a driving factor for evolution in the coming period, the Permian. Lasting 47 million years in total, the Permian period is when life on land really started to take on some more recognizable shapes and forms. During this time, the two aforementioned clades of amniotes, the synapsids and sauropsids, experienced a great deal of divergence, which would set them up for their later, more famous forms. In particular, compared to their earlier ancestors, the amphibians, which were largely more tied to the water, amniotes were capable of venturing deeper into the desert continent of Pangaea, largely thanks to their ability to reproduce on dry land, rather than being tied to the water, among other adaptations, such as better homeostasis to cope with the intense dry conditions. Life during the Permian was brutal for the species on land, and several mass extinctions are proposed to have occurred at this time. Still, by the end of the period, life on land had established itself well, although species richness was already quite limited by this point. The subsequent Permian Triassic extinction, known often as the Great Dying, would hence prove devastating, with a whopping 70% of terrestrial species and up to 96% of marine species being wiped out. It was so bad that this is the only known mass extinction event to have severely impacted insect life. The Great Dying is widely agreed upon to be the worst extinction event the world has ever seen, and the closest life on Earth has ever come to dying out entirely. Still, life on Earth, be it on land or in the seas, yet again trudged forwards, albeit in a very battered and bruised state. And so we entered the next era of Earth's history, the Mesozoic, perhaps one of the most iconic eras of all. Why? Well, because this is when the dinosaurs dominated the Earth. As with everything great, though, the dinosaurs' rule started out with humble origins in the first period of the Mesozoic, the Triassic, which lasted from around 252 to 201 million years ago. Following the devastating Permian Triassic extinction, only a small number of species pulled through, but those that survived found themselves in a very different world to the one they'd previously evolved in. Given the sheer devastation of the Great Dying, it would also take life on Earth millions of years to recover to anything near the Permian's diversity. Recovery started slowly, to say the least. During the early Triassic, the climate was incredibly dry and arid around the equators, while the poles had much more temperate climates. During this time, perhaps the most successful species to pull through was the rather humble Lystrosaurus, which spread out across much of Pangaea and may have accounted for as much as 95% of all life on land. To say they were successful during this time would have been an understatement. The Lystrosaurus was an early synapsid that evolved in the late Permian and made it through the extinction event, likely due to their ability to burrow, which may have helped them survive the devastating climate disaster. Other hypotheses for why the Lystrosaurus survived when other species died out include evidence of possible torpor, analogous to hibernation. Suggestions that Lystrosaurus's large lungs and short internal nostrils may have allowed them to breathe more rapidly at a time when the atmosphere was rich in carbon dioxide, and the smaller L. curvatus's less specialized diet, allowing it to feed on the few surviving land plants that made it through. Furthermore, with the absence of many predators and little herbivorous competition at the time, their numbers were able to skyrocket during the early Triassic. In short, no other single species of land animal has ever managed to achieve quite such dominance of the world at any one time. Still, the Lystrosaurus wasn't the only animal on land during this time, and there were several other creatures scuttling around as well. Critically, early cynodonts also survived the extinction and evolved rapidly during the Triassic in the absence of competition, as well as the archosaurs. In the end, the Lystrosaurus's incredible rule would be short-lived, and by the middle Triassic, life on Earth had finally begun to recover from the extinction. Archosaurs began to diversify rapidly, and the earliest marine reptiles began to achieve new levels of diversity. Indeed, by the late Triassic, life on land had largely recovered, and critically, the very first members of the Dinosauria clade had evolved, such as the Plateosaurus, Eoraptor, Herrerasaurus, and Coelophysis. Now we're finally approaching perhaps the most famous period of life on Earth, the Jurassic. During this time, the supercontinent of Pangaea was beginning to split into two landmasses, Laurasia and Gondwana, and the entire climate was much warmer than it is today, so much so that even the poles did not have ice caps. As such, life was able to spread across the continents. There was a lot going on during this period, far more than we could cover today alone. However, there were several key events that would perhaps define the time. Of course, the domination of land by the dinosaurs was undoubtedly the most well-known of all, with many iconic dinosaurs appearing during this period. The very first birds also appeared during this time, with Archaeopteryx, believed to be a transitional species between birds and dinosaurs, appearing in the late Jurassic. Rhynchocephalians also spread across the globe during the Jurassic, becoming the dominant small reptiles with many different lifestyles, such as the aquatic pleurosaurs. And then, of course, there were our own ancestors, the mammaliaforms. This clade diversified significantly during the Jurassic, although generally remained small in size, living in the shadow of the dinosaurs. The mammaliaforms likely also evolved live birth or viviparity during this period, with the earliest known examples including Juramea. It wasn't just the terrestrial non-avian dinosaurs that were dominating the world at this point, though. Indeed, the very first pterosaurs diversified rapidly during the Jurassic. And no, pterosaurs were not technically dinosaurs, although they did still belong to the same clade as the dinosaurs, the Avametatarsalia. Several Jurassic pterosaurs included Dimorphodon, Rhamphorhynchus, and Scaphognathus. Don't worry if you've never heard of these species before. Their later cousins would become much more famous. Under the waters, marine reptiles exploded in diversity and dominated many marine environments. The beloved Ichthyosaurus was just one species present during this time, but after a strong heyday, the Ichthyosauria clade lost a lot of diversity and representation by the mid-Jurassic. Long-necked plesiosauroids and short-necked pliosaurs represented the Sauropterygian taxon during this time, with species such as the Plesiosaurus and Attenborosaurus thriving in the early Jurassic, Liopleurodon in the Middle Jurassic, and the Pliosaurus in the Late Jurassic. Early turtles also diversified during this period, such as the Platycalidae and the Cynaspoderites. These groups were also joined by the Thalattosuchia, commonly known as the marine crocs, as well as a plethora of newly diverged modern shark orders and fish. In fact, the Jurassic would see an explosion in shark diversity, and most modern shark groups would evolve during this time, although the marine reptiles would largely stay the dominant marine predators for now. With diversity at a peak once again, things were undoubtedly turbulent heading into the final period of the Mesozoic era, the Cretaceous. Though many people don't directly know this period, this is when many of the most iconic species actually came into being, with the land still being dominated by the dinosaurs and the seas being ruled by terrifying marine reptiles. Indeed, life reached truly incredible extremes during this period. Certainly not a time you'd want to be at the bottom of the food chain, with monstrous creatures prowling the lands, and at a time when even the herbivores posed a deadly threat. The theropod dinosaurs were perhaps the most well-recognized carnivores during this time, evolving to include several of the largest terrestrial carnivores to have ever prowled the Earth, especially during the late Cretaceous. These included the Tyrannosaurus rex in modern North America, the Giganotosaurus in modern Argentina, and the Carcharodontosaurus and Spinosaurus from North Africa. This massive size was seen in the other two dinosaur clades at the time, too. The ornithischians evolved to massive sizes, with species such as the Edmontosaurus and the Shantungosaurus, while the scales were positively shattered by the colossal sauropodomorphs, the largest animals to have ever walked the Earth. It wasn't just the dinosaurs that grew to extreme sizes, though. Many other reptile species also followed suit. The pterosaurs evolved to become some of the largest animals to ever fly at this time, including the Hatzegopteryx thambema and Quetzalcoatlus northropi. Once again, life under the water also underwent extreme diversification, as it had in the Jurassic. Modern sharks became increasingly common, while mosasaurs diverged explosively during the late Cretaceous, placing extreme pressure on other marine reptiles such as plesiosaurs and ichthyosaurs. Indeed, by the late Cretaceous, ichthyosaurs in particular had declined significantly. The plesiosaurs continued to fight to maintain their position on the food chain, although evidence does suggest that the largest mosasaurs may have occasionally preyed upon smaller plesiosaurs. Unfortunately, as we've seen time and time again throughout the history of the Earth, nothing lasts forever. And the late Cretaceous world was a ticking time bomb. And the age of dinosaurs was about to come to an explosive end in the single most famous extinction event in the world, the Cretaceous-Paleogene extinction event, otherwise known as the KPG extinction, or the day the dinosaurs died. This is largely believed to be the result of a massive asteroid strike off the Gulf of Mexico, resulting in the Chicxulub crater, which caused literal global shockwaves that brought ecosystems to their knees in a matter of moments. As soon as the asteroid struck the Earth, most species were doomed. In fact, it is widely believed that all animal species above 25 kilograms would have been killed off, with only small generalists, namely omnivores, insectivores, and scavengers, pulling through into the following era, the Cenozoic. Critically, all of the non-avian dinosaurs were wiped out, along with the majority of large tetrapods, excluding several sea turtles and crocodilians. In short, unless you could survive on the detritus and insects that remained in the immediate aftermath of the extinction, or if you could go long periods without eating, you didn't have much chance. Amazingly, despite being one of the most violent extinctions, the KPG extinction wasn't anywhere near as bad as the Great Dying that had seen in the Age of the Dinosaurs. Still, the non-avian dinosaurs were now gone, along with most of the marine reptiles and all of the pterosaurs, which opened new opportunities for the remaining species. And as we entered the Cenozoic, the mammaliaform's patience had finally paid off. We were finally entering the age of mammals. Starting with the Paleogene period, rapid diversification was soon seen as the world began to recover from the KPG extinction, with the mammals and birds very quickly diversifying to take on new niches. Similarly, percomorph fish, which had only recently appeared during the late Cretaceous, also experienced rapid diversification, eventually becoming the most diverse group of fish on Earth. At the start of the Paleogene, the Earth was still very hot, with average temperatures of around 24 degrees Celsius or 75 degrees Fahrenheit. This brief period of warm climate would allow thick forests to appear worldwide, in turn supporting the re-increasing diversity of animal life. Unfortunately, early Paleocene mammals are generally not well represented in the fossil record due to their initial small size, meaning most of what we know comes from fossilized teeth. However, by the end of the Paleocene, new mammal groups were starting to emerge. These included early carnivorous mammals, e.g. the Ankylodon, and some of the first large browsing mammals, such as the Coryphodon. Perhaps the most striking Paleocene animal, however, was the Gastornis, a massive flightless bird that lived in Europe and, despite its terrifying appearance, was likely herbivorous. Less so was the carnivorous Paleopsilopterus, which has been argued to have evolved somewhere between the late Paleocene and early Eocene, and which definitely deserved its place in the Forest-Racidae family, aka the terror birds. Yikes. Several freshwater crocodilians and crocodiliforms had also survived, such as the Borealosuchus. After declining previously during the Cretaceous, turtles also pulled through the extinction and actually recovered by the end of the Paleocene. Incredibly, though the KPG wiped out most species, turtles actually made it through relatively less harmed, with around 80% of turtle species surviving. One such example is the Carbonimus coffrini, which had a carapace of around 1.7 meters. Similarly, amphibians also pulled through the extinction somewhat unfazed. In the seas, with the marine reptiles out of the way, acanthomorphs diversified massively, despite having been previously rare after the extinction event. Although fossil evidence is limited, by the start of the following period, the Eocene, these fish had already reached modern levels of diversification. Somewhat surprisingly, though, early sharks and rays weren't as successful at exploiting the newly opened niches following the KPG extinction, and largely just evolved to refill the niches they'd previously held. Still, this period would set things in motion for later shark success, with the first megatoothed shark, Otodus obliquus, appearing in the fossil record from the Paleocene. Following the re-establishment of biodiversity after the extinction, the Eocene ran from 56 million to 33.9 million years ago, with the climate again being incredibly warm compared to modern temperatures. Despite being small in size compared to the previous and later species, diversification continued rapidly, with hoofed ungulates evolving into their two modern groups. Many early equids evolved, such as the Sifrhippus and Eohippus, while primates, rodents, proboscideans, and bats all also appeared around this time. Approaching the later Eocene, ungulates grew far larger, such as the iconic Megacerops. The Eocene also saw new diversity among mammalian land predators, including the success of the hyenodon and the so-called bear dogs, represented by the Daephinus. False saber-toothed cats, the Nimravids, also became some of the first feliforms to appear in the fossil record, while Hesperocyon was one of the earliest canids. It wasn't just on land that mammals were taking hold, though, and marine mammals were rapidly following a similar path to their predecessors, the marine reptiles. Early whales had already established themselves well under the waves, and cetaceans became fully aquatic during this period. One such example is the well-known Basilosaurus. The Sirenians, which today include dugongs and manatees, also followed suit, with the Prorastomus and Pesosiren being among the oldest known members of this group to evolve an aquatic lifestyle. Sharks also continued to increase in diversity, with many species being known to be similar to modern species, such as the Alopius latidens, an extinct thresher shark, the Anomodon, related to modern goblin sharks, the Eogaleus and Physogaleus, extinct genuses of Requiem shark, and of course several mackerel sharks, namely the Macrorhizotus and Otodus. The latter would become especially pivotal later on, but for now, it still measured an impressive maximum of around 9 meters. Birds continued to thrive during this period too, with the aforementioned Gastornis remaining a key presence across Europe and Asia. Many primitive members of modern groups also evolved, such as the Inkayaku, an early penguin, and even early ostrich relatives like Pseudocrypterus. Looking further forward to the Oligocene, significant changes were on the horizon. Quite literally, in fact, with landscapes changing as tropical forests regressed to the equatorial belt, while grasslands exploded across the globe. These new open landscapes completely changed evolutionary pressures, along with cooling climate temperatures, which made larger bodies easier to maintain. As such, the majority of modern mammals had evolved by the Oligocene, including the Old World monkeys. Many species evolved to run for longer and further during this time, in line with the establishment of open grasslands. Similarly, many species grew larger, with the Paraceratherium becoming one of the largest land mammals to walk the earth. Sebecosuchians, which had first evolved in the Middle Jurassic, still remained one of the apex predators at the time, along with the terror birds such as the Physornis and Paraphizornis and the Boreanidae. However, new carnivorous species were also slowly beginning to make an appearance, such as the first felids, the Proailurus, in the late Oligocene. Things weren't quite so positive under the water, though. Indeed, with the contraction of the Tethys Ocean, marine biodiversity changed drastically, and most marine biodiversity began to move towards the Indo-Pacific Oceans instead. The changing ocean environment also led to the evolution of echolocation in marine mammals, and older cetaceans that did not have echolocation began to decrease in response. The cooling observed during the Oligocene would again continue into the Miocene, which is the first epoch of the Neogene period. During the Miocene, rapid cooling led to a series of ice ages, although this was interjected by warmer windows of time too. Notably, the climate and landscapes were generally coalescing to resemble our modern climate more so. Grasslands became the predominant land-based ecosystem for much of the land on Earth, allowing for the evolution of many modern flora and fauna. Critically, as grasses evolved to become more fibrous, the evolution of long-legged grazing species also increased, with browsers becoming fewer as the availability of browse decreased. As time passed by, although large mammals remained successful, diversity began to fall, with environments generally becoming dominated by a smaller number of species. Notably, the three-toed horses died off, such as Myohippus, along with several gomphotheres and the hyenodonts. The very end of the Miocene saw the arrival of a brand new member in the hominidae family, the hominins. Admittedly, these were still a long way removed from our own species, Homo sapiens, but it would set the ball rolling on our own evolution. However, while African species began to diversify more during this time, European ape species began to decline and die out as habitats became more uniform. It wasn't only our own family that saw new success during the Miocene. The cetaceans also achieved unparalleled diversity during this time, which may have also been driven by competition from the rapidly evolving megatoothed sharks. And yes, the Odontos megalodon finally entered the scene during this time. The pinniped clade also diversified rapidly during the Miocene, after first appearing in the Oligocene, and took on more aquatic lifestyles, although they still remained tied to the land, as with modern species. As the geologic clock slowly approaches midnight, we enter the Pliocene. Following previous trends, the climate cooled significantly overall, although it was still somewhat warmer than today. The time period was largely influenced by a land bridge between Alaska and Siberia that flooded periodically, allowing for mass migrations of species across land and sea. During this time, most species settled into relatively modern body plans, with a few exceptions. The earliest saber-toothed cats and hyenas evolved, competing with established predators such as dogs, bears, and weasels. Meanwhile, our own ancestors, the Australopithecines, continued to evolve in Africa. In contrast, the terror birds, which had dominated the world since the fall of the dinosaurs, finally began to lose their position as top predator, and few remained. The Titanes was likely one of the last to roam the Earth, although the family continued to fight on until relatively recently. Similarly, the megalodon just about made it into the early Pliocene. However, the cooling waters and falling sea levels are believed to have pushed them to extinction, coupled with their main prey, the baleen whales, migrating into colder waters where the meg simply couldn't survive. And so, we finally reach the Quaternary period of the Cenozoic. The divide between the Neogene and the Quaternary was marked by the Quaternary glaciation events, which triggered numerous climate change events overall. The first period of the Quaternary is the Pleistocene, and the highly changeable climate conditions and periods of glaciation and cooling largely defined the time. Large mammals were vastly more common during the Pleistocene, with many of the most iconic mammals from history appearing during this time, largely popularized by Hollywood. Mastodons, smilodons, aurochs, short-faced bears, giant sloths, the elephant bird, the Haast's eagle, megalania, myelania, glyptodons, woolly rhinoceroses, and many more. Even our own distant relatives experienced gigantism during this time, such as the Gigantopithecus. Speaking of us, some of the earliest species of Homo appeared during the Pleistocene, and these migrated from Africa to spread throughout Afro-Eurasia, later also migrating to the Americas and Australia. Species such as Homo neanderthalensis, yes, the Neanderthals, and the Denisovans, Homo longi, are proposed to have been very closely related to our own species, branching off from an ancient shared ancestor with us, potentially Homo heidelbergensis. The Neanderthals and Denisovans went extinct around 40,000 and 30,000 years ago, respectively, during this period. However, Denisovan and Neanderthal DNA in modern humans suggests that these two species occasionally still interbred with our Homo sapiens ancestors. So their legacy arguably lives on to this day. Along with the extinction of our fellow Homo species, many of the megafaunal species also went extinct at the end of the Pleistocene, being replaced largely by smaller and more swift-footed species. And so, as we finally look past the last glacial period, we reach the Holocene, the current geological epoch, which began around 11,700 years ago. As the shortest epoch, we are currently in an interglacial period, although we are technically still living within the ongoing glacial cycles of the Quaternary period. So, yes, we are technically still in an ice age. Most of the megafauna, excluding those in Africa, an estimated 81% of all megaherbivores went extinct in the late Pleistocene, driven both by changing climates and human predation and damage to environments. As such, today, most remaining species are of a mid-size or smaller. However, there are a few notable exceptions. The blue whale, for example, is the largest animal known to have ever lived on Earth, weighing upwards potentially of 200 tons in rare cases. Meanwhile, the heaviest land animal alive today is the African bush elephant, the heaviest recorded individual being estimated to around 11 tons in weight. Of course, that's a long shot from the heaviest known sauropod, a giraffe titan that may have weighed up to 39.5 tons. While the Holocene is the current and final geologic epoch, there has been one more epoch proposed, although this was officially rejected by the ICS and IUGS, the Anthropocene epoch. This unofficial epoch refers to the time period for which Homo sapiens, us, have been driving planetary change, correlating with the sixth mass extinction the world has ever seen, the Holocene extinction event. Unfortunately, this extinction event is still ongoing and is the result of our own actions. In fact, biodiversity loss and the rate of extinction has been estimated to be 1,000 times higher than natural levels. The worst part? While the other mass extinctions were the result of natural processes or unavoidable natural disasters, we are well aware of this one. And so it begs the question, can we reverse the damage in time, or are we on track for an ecological disaster? Thanks so much everyone for sticking with me during this massive video, and I'm so sorry for the huge delay. I've been going through a lot in my personal life, but I've tried hard all the same to make this as thorough and accurate as I could. It's also the biggest video I've made so far, and I'd love to go even more in depth and break down each of the eons and eras of Earth's history in more detail if that's something you'd like to see. Let me know in the comments if so. A big shout out to Paleoanalysis History of the Earth series for inspiring this video. I highly recommend checking it out. And in the meantime, please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more Paleo Brew videos soon.